Part 1 At the Sound of a New Age. The winter sky over southern Germany in 1942 looked no different from the skies that had witnessed centuries of human conflict. Clouds drifted slowly across a pale gray horizon. Wind pushed through frozen grass fields near a remote airstrip. Mechanics walked slowly between experimental aircraft, their breath visible in the cold air. War had already transformed Europe into a continent of smoke and iron. Yet on this quiet airfield, something even more radical than war itself was about to be born. For decades, aircraft had followed the same fundamental law of motion. Propellers sliced through the air, pulling machines forward like mechanical birds. From the fragile biplanes of the First World War to the sleek fighters of the early 1940s, every aircraft depended on spinning blades and piston engines. Engineers pushed those designs to their limits, squeezing more horsepower, more speed, more altitude from machines that were already approaching the edge of possibility. Yet a small group of German engineers believed that the future of flight would not belong to propellers at all. Among them were brilliant but often frustrated designers who had spent years imagining a different kind of aircraft, the one powered not by rotating blades but by pure thrust. The idea was simple in theory but terrifying in practice: compress air, mix it with fuel, ignite it, and force the resulting explosion backward at immense velocity. The reaction would push the aircraft forward with unprecedented power. It was a concept that had existed mostly in theoretical papers and fragile prototypes. Now, under the pressure of total war, Germany was determined to make it real. At the center of this effort stood a strange-looking aircraft unlike anything that had flown before. It had swept wings and two large engine pods hanging beneath them. The engines looked bulky and unfinished, almost improvised. Mechanics and engineers circled the aircraft carefully, checking cables, tightening bolts, studying gauges. They knew they were standing beside something that could change the nature of air combat forever or explode before it ever left the ground. The pilot climbed into the cockpit slowly. The canopy closed with a metallic click. Inside the aircraft, the instruments vibrated faintly as technicians prepared the engines. These were not conventional piston engines. They were the fragile and experimental Junkers Jumo 004 turbojets, machines capable of pushing the aircraft beyond 800 km per hour, faster than any operational fighter in existence. But they were also unreliable, delicate, and prone to catastrophic failure. When the engines finally ignited, the airfield filled with the sound few people had ever heard before. There was no propeller roar. Instead, a deep, continuous thunder rolled across the runway, like distant artillery that never stopped firing. Flames shimmered inside the engine exhaust. The aircraft trembled like a creature waking from hibernation. As the throttle advanced, the aircraft began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The pilot felt the strange, smooth surge of jet thrust, different from anything piston aircraft had ever produced. The machine accelerated down the runway, wheels bouncing across frozen concrete. Then, suddenly, the ground fell away beneath it. The aircraft climbed into the sky. In that moment, humanity crossed an invisible line. The age of jet aviation had begun. Part 2: Engineers Against Time. The Me-262 did not emerge from a single moment of inspiration. It was the product of years of relentless experimentation, failure, and obsession. Long before the aircraft ever touched the sky, engineers in Germany had been wrestling with the problem of jet propulsion, a technology that promised incredible speed but brought with it a host of terrifying challenges. Jet engines were brutally simple in concept yet incredibly difficult to build. Compressors had to spin at unimaginable speeds. Temperatures inside the combustion chambers reached levels that could melt ordinary metals. Fuel systems needed to operate with perfect stability under violent conditions. Even the smallest engineering mistake could cause the engine to disintegrate in seconds. The Junkers Jumo 004 engine at the heart of the Me-262A was itself a desperate compromise. Germany's wartime shortages meant that engineers could not always use the ideal materials. High-temperature alloys were scarce. Precision manufacturing facilities were stretched to their limits. As a result, many parts of the engine were made using substitute metals that degraded rapidly under heat and stress. Pilots who tested the aircraft learned quickly that these engines demanded absolute respect. If the throttle was moved too quickly, the compressor blades could shatter. If the temperature climbed too high, the engine could burn itself apart. The average operational life of a Jumo 004 engine was sometimes as little as 25 hours. In the brutal mathematics of wartime engineering, that was considered acceptable. Yet despite these limitations, the Me-262 offered something no other fighter could match: speed. At full power, it could outrun nearly every Allied aircraft in the sky. Propeller-driven fighters struggled to even catch a glimpse of it. When the jet streaked across the sky, it moved with a terrifying smoothness that made traditional dogfighting tactics almost obsolete. But the aircraft's development unfolded during one of the most chaotic periods of the war. Allied bombing campaigns were devastating German industrial infrastructure. Factories were destroyed. Supply lines collapsed. Engineers often worked in underground facilities or makeshift workshops carved into forests and mountainsides. Even worse, the aircraft's development became entangled in political interference at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Adolf Hitler, fascinated by the potential of new weapons, insisted that the Me-262 be used as a high-speed bomber rather than purely as a fighter. Engineers and pilots protested the decision. They knew the aircraft's true strength lay in intercepting Allied bombers. But the order stood, delaying the jet's full deployment for months. Time was slipping away. Every week that passed allowed Allied forces to strengthen their air superiority. American B-17 and B-24 bombers filled the skies over Germany in massive formations. Escort fighters such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt extended their reach deep into German territory. Against this overwhelming force, the Me-262 represented Germany's last technological gambling, a machine that might restore balance in the air. But the aircraft was still fragile. The engines were unreliable. Pilots required special training. Production struggled to keep pace with demand. And the war was closing in from every direction. Part 3: The first jet fighter enters war. By 1944, the skies over Europe had become one of the most contested battlefields in human history. Thousands of aircraft clashed daily above burning cities, shattered railways, and smoking industrial centers. Allied bomber fleets advanced in enormous formations, escorted by long-range fighters that hunted German interceptors across the sky. Germany's once dominant Luftwaffe had been steadily worn down by years of combat. Pilots were scarce. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft production struggled to keep up with relentless losses. Into this desperate environment entered a machine that looked as if it had come from the future. The Me-262 Schwalbe, meaning Swallow, arrived in operational units with sleek swept wings and twin turbojet engines that roared with unfamiliar power. Even experienced Luftwaffe pilots felt a sense of awe when they first saw it. Compared to traditional fighters like the Bf-109 or Fw-190, the Me-262 seemed almost alien. Its engines produced no propeller blur, no visible spinning blades. Instead, it surged forward on a stream of invisible thrust. The first pilots who flew it quickly realized they were controlling something revolutionary. The aircraft accelerated with astonishing force once the jet engines reached full power. Allied fighters could struggle desperately to keep up, but the Me-262 could simply outrun them in level flight. This advantage allowed German pilots to attack Allied bomber formations with the terrifying new tactic, high-speed interception. The jet would approach the bomber's stream at extreme velocity, fire its weapons in a single devastating pass, and escape before escort fighters could respond. Mounted in the nose of the Me-262 were four powerful 30mm Mk-108 cannons, guns capable of shredding heavy bombers with only a few hits. In later variants, the aircraft also carried R-4M rockets designed specifically to break apart tightly packed bomber formations. For the crews of Allied bombers, the appearance of the Me-262 was deeply unsettling. Pilots reported seeing a strange aircraft flash past them faster than anything they had encountered before. Sometimes they barely had time to react before explosions ripped through their formation. The jet's speed meant it was often gone before defensive gunners could even aim properly. Yet the Me-262 was not invincible. Its jet engines required long runways and careful handling during takeoff and landing. At low speeds, the aircraft was vulnerable. Allied intelligence quickly learned to exploit this weakness. Fighter patrols began targeting German airfields, waiting for the jets to return from missions when they were slow, low, and exposed. Despite these dangers, the Me-262 proved itself one of the most formidable aircraft of the war. Experienced pilots like Adolf Galland recognized its potential immediately. In the hands of skilled aviators, the jet could dominate the sky for brief but decisive moments. But the war had reached a point where even revolutionary technology could not reverse the tide. Allied forces were advancing across Europe. German fuel reserves were collapsing. Factories were being destroyed faster than they could produce aircraft. The Me-262 was the most advanced fighter of its time, but it had arrived too late to change the outcome of the war. Part 4: A Terror in the Bomber's Streams. For the men flying inside Allied bombers, the war in the skies above Europe had already become a brutal test of endurance. Missions often lasted 8 hours or more. Crews sat inside vibrating metal fuselages while anti-aircraft shells exploded around them and enemy fighters attacked from every direction. They flew through freezing temperatures, suffocating oxygen masks, and constant fear. Then the jets appeared. Unlike traditional German fighters that climbed slowly toward the bomber formations, the Me-262 arrived like a sudden thunderbolt. Crews often saw it only seconds before the attack. A silver shape would streak through the formation at terrifying speed. Moments later, cannon shells would slam into the bombers with devastating force. The 30mm Mk-108 cannons carried by the Me-262 were designed for destruction. 1 or 2 hits could cripple a heavy bomber instantly. Wings could snap. Engines exploded. Entire aircraft disintegrated under the impact of the shells. For the gunners trying to defend the bomber formation, the jet's speed made accurate targeting almost impossible. The psychological effect was enormous. Bomber crews had trained to defend themselves against piston fighters that circled and maneuvered. They could track those aircraft with machine guns. But the Me-262 attacked so quickly that it felt almost supernatural, appearing and disappearing before anyone fully understood what had happened. Yet even this terrifying weapon faced limitations. The Me-262 required careful maintenance and precious fuel. Germany could only produce a few hundred of them during the final phase of the war. Pilots often flew multiple missions per day, pushing both themselves and their aircraft to the limit. Allied forces adapted quickly. Fighter escorts learned to patrol aggressively near known jet airfields. Radar stations tracked the jets as they took off. American and British pilots discovered that if they waited near German runways, they could catch the Me-262 during its most vulnerable moments. Dogfights between piston fighters and jet aircraft became strange encounters. The Me-262 could outrun its enemies easily, but it could not always outmaneuver them at low speeds. Skilled Allied pilots sometimes managed to trap the jet when it slowed down to land or when its engines took too long to respond. In those rare moments, the future and the past collided in violent spirals of gunfire. Part 5A Pilots of the Jet Age. Flying the Me-262 required a different mindset than any aircraft that had come before it. Pilots quickly discovered that the jet demanded patience, precision, and constant awareness of its fragile engines. Sudden throttle movements could destroy the compressors. Rapid maneuvers could cause catastrophic engine failure. Many pilots described their first flights as both exhilarating and terrifying. The aircraft accelerated smoothly once the engines reached full power, but until that moment it felt strangely sluggish. The jet engines took time to spool up. Unlike piston aircraft that responded instantly to throttle changes, the Me-262 demanded anticipation. Yet once airborne at speed, the aircraft revealed its true personality. It was fast, unbelievably fast for its time. The horizon seemed to rush toward the cockpit in a way that no propeller-driven fighter could match. Pilots spoke of feeling as if they had stepped into the future of aviation. One of the most famous Me-262 commanders, Adolf Galland, recognized that the aircraft represented the next generation of warfare. He fought constantly with the German High Command to deploy the jet purely as a fighter rather than as a bomber. Galland believed that large numbers of Me-262s, properly organized and supported, could have dramatically disrupted Allied bombing operations. But by the time specialized jet units were finally formed, Germany's situation had already deteriorated beyond recovery. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft. Replacement parts were scarce. Training programs rushed inexperienced pilots into advanced machines they barely understood. Despite these challenges, Me-262 units still managed to inflict serious losses on Allied bombers during the final months of the war. Each successful interception demonstrated the frightening potential of jet-powered combat. Pilots on both sides understood that something historic was unfolding above the battlefields of Europe. The Me-262 was not just another aircraft. It was a glimpse of what air combat would become in the decades that followed. Part 6A Too Late for Victory.
Incredible.
By early 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of total war. Allied armies advanced from the west and east, while relentless bombing reduced cities and factories to ruins. The Me-262 continued to fly combat missions, but it was no longer part of a strategy that could change the course of the conflict. The aircraft that had once symbolized technological hope now flew in a sky that belonged to the Allies. Fuel shortages grounded many jets before they could even take off. Airfields were bombed repeatedly. Maintenance crews struggled to keep damaged engines operational. Even so, the Me-262 left an unmistakable impression on the pilots who encountered it. Allied fighter pilots respected its speed and firepower. Intelligence officers studied captured examples carefully, realizing that jet propulsion represented the future of aviation. When the war finally ended, many Me-262 aircraft were captured intact by Allied forces. Engineers from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union examined them with intense curiosity. The aircraft's aerodynamic design, swept wings, and turbojet engines became valuable sources of knowledge for the next generation of fighter development. In the years that followed, jet aircraft would become the standard for military aviation. Fighters like the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15 would dominate the skies during the Korean War. Civilian airliners would eventually carry passengers across oceans at speeds unimaginable during the era of propeller aircraft. All of those advancements traced part of their lineage back to the Me-262. Part 7 At the birth of the jet era. The Me-262 did not win the war. It did not appear in large enough numbers to alter history. Yet its true significance lies in something deeper than battlefield statistics. It marked the moment when aviation crossed from one technological age into another. Before the Me-262, aircraft relied on propellers and piston engines, machines that had evolved steadily since the earliest days of flight. After the Me-262, the world entered the age of jet propulsion. Speed barriers that once seemed impossible were suddenly within reach. For the pilots who first heard the thunder of jet engines in the skies over Europe, the sound carried a strange mixture of fear and awe. It was the sound of the future arriving early, born in the chaos of war but destined to reshape the world far beyond it. The Me-262 Schwalbe remains one of the most important aircraft ever built. Not because it was perfect, but because it proved that the future of flight would belong to jets. And when that first prototype lifted off from a frozen runway in 1942, the age of the jet had already begun.